Chapter 1. The story of empowerment of society's most valuable beings and beings. This story about empowerment of two very important contributors to our society here has never before been told to the world. It is therefore a must-read for any person interested in the topic of empowerment. We will attempt to present how the most neglected beings in human history and in the plant history have over time resiliently fought for recognition and leadership, and how both beings have in the modern world almost reached their goals. In the world of plants, the mung lentil bean has for centuries been a highly neglected pulse without societies refusing to recognize or accept its value. Eerily, a similar situation also developed in the world of human beings. Here village girls of South India and many other parts of the world proved to be of great value to society, yet were highly neglected, and remained in this status even longer than the mung bean, who started to gain recognition in the medieval period, about 400 years ago. The mung bean wasn't born into greatness. It didn't grow on golden stalks like wheat. It wasn't pampered with endless water baths like rice. It didn't get mentioned in royal banquets or poetry about prosperity. It was just there. Much like village girls in South India, who were expected to be helpful, supportive, and politely invisible, never standing out too much, never demanding too much, never being a problem. The village girls, small, ignored, and expected to stay in the background, were taught that their job was not to shine, but to quietly support the bigger players. The boys were encouraged to dream big, but the girls were handed smaller expectations, as if their ambition should sprout only within limits set by tradition. But history has a funny way of forgetting the ones who truly matter. And while the world was busy worshipping its preferred choices, the mung bean and the village girls were quietly learning how to survive, without privilege, without applause, without asking permission. They were watching, waiting, biding their time, because history had underestimated them both. Some revolutions don't start with noise. They start with quiet resilience, with unyielding endurance, with the unwavering refusal to fade. And history was about to find out underestimating them was the worst mistake of all. Chapter 2. The mung bean's first fight. Survival in the shadow of giants. The wheat fields stretched endlessly across the plains, basking in their golden glow, while rice paddies shimmered with the promise of prosperity. Farmers worshipped these crops, building their civilizations around their abundance. And somewhere in the corner, almost embarrassed to exist, stood the mung bean. No songs were sung about it. No festivals celebrated its harvest. It was too small, too humble, too forgettable. But history had a way of rewarding persistence. Much like village girls in South India who quietly followed centuries of expectations, the mung bean knew it could not compete with the giants on their terms. So instead, it did what neither wheat nor rice could do. It survived. While rice cried for water, the mung bean thrived in drought. While wheat demanded fertile soil, the mung bean replenished depleted land. While both crumbled in harsh conditions, the mung bean dug deeper, endured, and waited. Village girls watched their brothers take the best schools, the best opportunities, the best seats at the table. But they too dug deeper, endured, and waited, because change was coming. And like the mung bean, they were preparing for their moment. The fight for recognition had begun, and both the mung bean and generations of village girls refused to surrender. Chapter 3. The mung bean's first test: drought, doubt, and the reluctance of recognition the sun did not care about fairness. It burned without hesitation, without mercy, without the slightest regard for which crops needed rain and which did not. The wheat suffered. The rice wilted. The barley begged for relief. And yet, the mung bean did not complain. Instead, it dug deeper, stretching its roots into the dry, cracked soil, whispering to the earth for just enough moisture to survive. It didn't need pity. It didn't need special treatment. It just needed time. Much like village girls in South India, who watched as their families poured resources into their brother's education, but barely noticed when they too had ambitions. Society treated them like delicate saplings that could not handle the storm of change. But just like the mung bean, they had quietly adapted, learning to survive on less, using every scrap of opportunity to grow their own resilience. The rain did not come, but the mung bean endured, and so did the village girls. Because history had proven one thing: the underestimated always find a way to thrive. Chapter 4. The Secret Strength: Why the Mung Bean Never Fails. By now, the other crops had started to whisper. How was this small, unimpressive bean still standing? Why had it not collapsed like the others? The answer was simple. It did not waste resources. While other crops demanded excessive water, the mung bean conserved every drop, using only what was necessary. It healed itself. Unlike grains that exhausted the soil, the mung bean replenished it, fixing nitrogen in the ground like an invisible gardener tending to the land. It grew fast. While rice sat waiting for ideal conditions, the mung bean sprouted within weeks, proving that survival belongs to those who act quickly instead of waiting for permission. It adapted to neglect. It did not need rich soil, perfect weather, or royal attention. It just needed the chance to prove its worth. Much like the village girls, who were told to stay in the shadows, but quietly learned everything they could, preparing for the day when the world would finally take them seriously. The mung bean was built for independence, and so were they. Chapter 5. The mung bean's moment: breaking expectations, one sprout at a time. The other crops were furious. They had spent generations being pampered, receiving ideal conditions, earning the adoration of civilizations. Now here was the mung bean, standing tall despite the lack of water, despite the neglected soil, despite the unbearable heat that had sent other crops into ruin. It was unapologetically thriving, proving that resilience was more powerful than privilege. Across the villages of South India, a similar frustration was brewing. The young girls, once expected to settle for less, were beginning to question everything. Why was education a luxury for them, but a right for their brothers? Why was ambition treated as unnecessary when they had just as much potential? Why were they expected to wilt when they could stand just as tall? Like the mung bean, they weren't waiting for permission anymore. They had started growing, whether society liked it or not. Chapter 6. The Science Behind Their Strength. The mung bean's success wasn't accidental. It was designed for survival. Deep roots. When times were tough, it didn't complain. It dug deeper, reaching for unseen moisture, refusing to be weakened. Much like village girls who dug deeper into their own willpower, learning to adapt and strengthen themselves. rapid growth. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, the mung bean sprouted fast, making use of even the smallest opportunities. Just like village girls, who grabbed every chance they got to prove their worth. Self-sufficiency. It didn't drain the land, it nourished it, feeding the soil, creating better conditions for future growth. Like generations of women who have uplifted their families, rebuilding society while still fighting their own battles. Adaptability to neglect. Even if the soil was poor, even if the climate was cruel, even if no one believed in it, it kept growing anyway. Much like every woman who was told she couldn't succeed, but did anyway. Chapter 7. The mung bean's silent revolt. The other crops still believed in status and prestige. Rice thought itself royalty, demanding fields flooded like a throne room. Wheat was convinced it was the foundation of civilization. Barley was just happy to be included, frankly. And yet, none of them noticed the quiet revolution happening beneath their roots. The mung bean, small, unnoticed, ignored, was changing the very foundation of the land. Like the village girls in South India, who had been told to stay in the background, the mung bean had spent centuries watching, listening, learning, waiting for its moment to rise. And when that moment came, it would not ask for permission. It would simply grow as it had always done. The empire, the traditions, the expectations, none of them would last forever. But the mung bean would. And so would they. Chapter 8. The myth of weakness and the reality of power. For centuries, the world assumed that small meant weak. If you weren't tall like a tree, you weren't strong. If you weren't loud like wheat, you weren't important. If you weren't grand like an empire, you weren't powerful. But the mung bean knew differently. It had seen small creatures rule the jungle. It had seen silent rivers carve mountains. It had seen tiny changes reshape entire civilizations. And much like the village girls who had been underestimated, the mung bean knew its worth. The world had just been too busy looking at the obvious choices to notice. But history never forgets the survivors. And both the mung bean and the women who had endured would prove their strength. Chapter 9. The mung bean's reckoning. The day it refused to stay small. For generations, the mung bean had stayed in the shadows. It had grown beneath the towering stalks of wheat, quietly fixing the soil while the bigger crops soaked up the glory. It had sprouted unnoticed between rows of rice, whispering its resilience while civilizations bowed to more prestigious grains. But time was running out for those who ignored it, because history always gives power to the quiet survivors. One day, the world woke up and realized it needed the mung bean more than it needed wheat, more than it needed rice, more than it needed every crop that had demanded attention for centuries. The future was changing. Droughts were getting worse. Land was degrading faster. Starvation was creeping into nations that had once been overflowing with food. And guess who was still standing tall? The humble, stubborn, unshakable mung bean. It was no longer optional. It was essential. Across South India, the village girls who had been overlooked for generations were facing the same reckoning. For years, tradition had told them they were too small to matter, too insignificant to demand change, too unimportant to shape the future. But much like the mung bean, they refused to accept this lie. They studied in secret, reading under dim lanterns when others told them their education wasn't necessary. They pushed through rejection, finding their voices even when society tried to silence them. They grew, despite every force working against them. And one day, just like the mung bean, they couldn't be ignored anymore. Chapter 10. The Neglected Seed and the Invisible Power. The mung bean wasn't born into greatness. It didn't grow on golden stalks like wheat. It wasn't pampered with endless water baths like rice. It didn't get mentioned in royal banquets or poetry about prosperity. It was just there, much like village girls in South India, who were expected to be helpful, supportive, and politely invisible, never standing out too much, never demanding too much, never being a problem. But history has a funny way of forgetting the ones who truly matter. And while the world was busy worshipping its preferred choices, the mung bean and the village girls were quietly learning how to survive. Without privilege, without applause, without asking permission. Because some revolutions don't start with noise, they start with persistence. Chapter 11. The Ayurvedic Discovery, the First Recognition. Picture this: a group of Ayurvedic healers sitting around, trying to figure out which foods are actually useful. Most ingredients arrive with a reputation. Wheat walks in, tossing its golden loss like a celebrity. Rice enters gracefully, smug about its dominance across continents. Spices march in dramatically, knowing they make or break entire cuisines. Then comes the mung bean, humble and quiet, barely getting noticed. Until one healer says, "Wait, this thing cures fevers, stops inflammation, restores strength, and grows when nothing else does." Suddenly, it's not just another boring bean. It's a miracle worker, a secret weapon, a tiny powerhouse that can heal the sick, feed the weak, and survive chaos. Much like the village girls, who started realizing, oh, I can think, I can innovate, I can do more than what I was told. And just like that, the narrative was shifting. The bean wasn't just food anymore, it was medicine. And the girls weren't just supportive figures anymore, they were leaders in the making. Chapter 12. War, Siege, and the Bean That Would Not Die. Imagine being trapped in a fortress, completely surrounded by enemies, running out of food faster than a bad reality show contestant. No supply chains. No reinforcements. No fancy military rations. Just a few sacks of mung beans sitting in the corner, barely noticed. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't impressive. But it was exactly what they needed to survive. Much like village girls, who weren't given royal treatment, but knew how to make the absolute most of their circumstances, turning scraps of opportunity into real success. So the soldiers ate mung bean gruel, drank mung bean soup, sprinkled mung bean powder into everything, and they kept fighting. Because sometimes survival isn't about having the best resources, it's about knowing how to use what little you have better than anyone else. And if there was anyone who could prove that point again and again, it was the mung bean and the women who refused to let history overlook them. Chapter 13. British colonialism and the silent rebellion. The British arrived with big ideas. Not about fairness, of course. Just profit. They saw cash crops, exports, and wealth, deciding that food wasn't a priority, trade was. And as wheat fields were replaced with cotton, as tea plantations pushed out native grains, people started starving on the very land that had once sustained them. But the farmers didn't just accept this fate. They fought back in silence. They planted mung beans beneath British cash crops, hiding them where colonial overseers wouldn't notice. And here's the best twist. While the British thought they were draining the land, the mung bean was quietly replenishing the soil, feeding nutrients back, making sure the empire's exploitation wasn't quite as effective as they thought. It was the perfect rebellion, small, unnoticed, but absolutely vital. Much like village girls who figured out how to educate themselves in secret, how to thrive despite restrictions, how to prepare for a future they weren't supposed to have. The empire believed in control, but the silent survivors believed in endurance. And endurance always wins in the end. Chapter 14. The British Army's Unexpected Lifeline. The British spent decades ignoring the mung bean, treating it as unimportant. Then came war. And suddenly, British soldiers needed food that wouldn't spoil, could be carried across battlefields, and actually kept them alive in miserable conditions. Guess what saved them? The mung bean. The very crop their empire had overlooked became their secret weapon in survival, cooked in wartime camps, stored for months, providing essential protein when nothing else was available. It was fast cooking, required less fuel, and kept armies marching when everything else failed. Much like village girls, who were told they weren't essential, only to later step up and run businesses, lead movements, shape industries, and create futures that no one had prepared for. Because you can dismiss a survivor, but you can't erase them. And just like the mung bean, the women proved their place in history was unavoidable. Chapter 15. The Rise of the Unseen Power. For centuries, the mung bean was overlooked, treated as nothing more than a side ingredient, humble, unnoticed, quietly growing while the world focused on grander crops. And much like the village girls in South India, it was expected to stay in the background, supporting survival but never claiming leadership. But time changes everything. When food shortages spread, when industrial farming failed, when climate disasters threatened the world's most prestigious crops, the mung bean did not falter, it flourished. It became the key to global food security, thriving where other plants collapsed. It became the lifeline for endurance, feeding warriors, athletes, and survivalists. It became the secret healer, restoring soil that had been drained for centuries. And alongside it, the village girls who had waited just as long were stepping forward. They had studied, even when society told them knowledge wasn't meant for them. They had worked, even when opportunity was scarce. They had endured, just as patiently as the mung bean, proving that resilience is the strongest power of all. They weren't asking for recognition anymore. They were taking it. Because survival isn't just about existing, it's about showing the world why existence matters. Chapter 16. The Art of Multitasking. Why village girls and mung beans do it best. If there's one thing science, history, and daily life have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's this. Village girls are the undefeated champions of multitasking. You think you can handle multiple responsibilities? Try a village girl balancing a clay pot on her head, stirring a boiling pot of dal, keeping an eye on a mischievous younger sibling, and calculating household expenses, all while holding an entire conversation about tomorrow's community event. And she's not even sweating. Meanwhile, boys, well, let's just say if a boy is asked to carry a bag of rice and hold an umbrella at the same time, His brain is already reaching full capacity. And speaking of rice, rice is equally terrible at multitasking. It needs constant attention, endless water, careful timing. If you don't measure exactly, stir exactly, soak exactly, congratulations, you've just created a mushy disaster or a rock-hard brick. Rice demands a single focus, just like boys who cannot, under any circumstances, have a serious conversation while tying their shoelaces. But the mung bean. The mung bean laughs in the face of single tasking. This unassuming little legume is growing, fixing nitrogen in the soil, feeding hungry populations, surviving drought, and secretly leading agricultural revolutions all at once. It can be boiled, sprouted, ground into flour, eaten raw, fed to livestock, used for skin care, and made into high-protein snacks, sometimes all within the same household, in the same week, by the same hard-working village girl. So the truth is undeniable. Village girls do everything effortlessly. Mung beans support everything effortlessly. Rice can barely manage being rice. Boys need step-by-step instructions for breathing. Some champions are loud, glamorous, and demand recognition. Others just quietly do the impossible every day and let history catch up when it's ready. And both mung beans and village girls have already won the game before anyone else even realized they were playing. Chapter 17. The future, where mung beans and village girls take over the world. The future isn't going to be kind to the weak. It's going to be hotter, harsher, and increasingly unforgiving. Climate change. Coming for delicate crops. Global crises. Eliminating the luxuries of life. Society. Redefining survival. And in this merciless new world, only two things are guaranteed to thrive. Mung beans. Village girls. Meanwhile, rice is still crying about irrigation problems. Wheat is too busy complaining about soil depletion, and boys, well, they're struggling to figure out how to boil an egg without calling for backup. Welcome to the new era of survival, where the underestimated rise while everyone else scrambles to catch up. Mung beans. The global supercrop of the future, it started slowly. Scientists began panicking. Crop failures, increasing droughts, unpredictable weather patterns. The world needed a food source that could endure anything, and that's when someone looked at the humble mung bean and said, "Wait a second, this thing never dies." And just like that, the mung bean became the most important food on the planet. Why? It grows fast, like really fast. It needs barely any water, like a stubborn desert survivor. It fixes nitrogen in soil, basically doing agriculture's job for free. It works in every meal, soups, snacks, flour, plant-based proteins, survival rations. Meanwhile, rice is too sensitive, wheat is falling apart under climate pressure, and other crops are begging for government subsidies just to stay relevant. Mung beans. They didn't ask for anything, they simply kept thriving. Lesson learned. If you wait long enough, the world eventually realizes your worth. Chapter 18. Village girls. The leaders of tomorrow. Now let's talk about South India's village girls who, much like mung beans, were never given enough credit until the world suddenly realized they were essential. Remember those early days when they were told to stay small, stay invisible, stay supportive? Yes, they didn't listen. Instead, they became everything at once: engineers, because while boys were busy overthinking math, village girls just solved the problem and moved on. Doctors, because while men argued over whose diagnosis was correct, village girls just saved the patient first. Politicians, because while others made speeches, they actually got things done. Agricultural innovators, because while everyone debated soil quality, they just planted the right crops mung beans, obviously, and fixed the problem. Essentially, they became the CEOs of survival, proving that while the world was distracted by nonsense, they had quietly prepared for the future. Rice, wheat, and boys. The struggle continues while village girls and mung beans flourished, the others, well, did not. Rice is still trying to figure out how to grow without water spoiler. It can't. Wheat is still breaking under climate change, maybe try being useful for once. Boys are still Googling how to multitask without crying. Meanwhile, villages across South India are now filled with women running industries, shaping policies, solving crises, and casually growing enough mung beans to save the planet, all before breakfast. And what do they say when asked how they became so powerful? Oh, we were always powerful, you just didn't notice. Final thoughts. The future belongs to survivors. Some crops demand attention. Some people beg for recognition. But true power doesn't ask for permission. It simply thrives. Mung beans waited centuries before the world realized they were essential. Village girls fought through generations before society admitted they were unstoppable. Now the future belongs to them. Because strength isn't about loudness. It's about resilience, adaptability, and never breaking, even when everything else collapses. And in this new world, the mung bean and the village girl will define survival, leadership, and undeniable success. As for wheat, rice, and boys, well, best of luck to them. Some power comes from immediate fame. Some comes from slow, silent growth, from proving worth against every obstacle, from refusing to break under pressure. The mung bean had done it. The village girls had done it. And now, both were standing exactly where history never expected them to be, leading the future. Chapter 18. The legacy that refuses to fade. The mung bean never asked to be famous. It never demanded a place in royal feasts, never insisted on being the centerpiece of grand meals. But it kept growing anyway. And much like the women who have fought for their place in history, it proved that strength doesn't need attention, it needs time. Because true power isn't loud, it's relentless. And nothing is more relentless than a survivor who refuses to fade, refuses to collapse, refuses to let history erase its worth. The world tried to push aside the village girls, just like it had tried to ignore the mung bean, telling them their role was to support, not to lead. But legacy isn't built on privilege, it's built on resilience. And when the dust settles, when history is rewritten, when futures are shaped, it will be the ones who never gave up, who will stand at the center of it all, leading, thriving, proving that endurance is unstoppable. And neither the mung bean nor the women who walked in its footsteps have ever known how to stop growing. Thank you for listening and watching our story. We hope you will rejoin us for our next story creation. Please remember to subscribe to our channel. The Traditional Village Girls of South India.